Chief Public Health Officer Theresa Tam has announced she will be stepping down on June 20th after a controversial tenure in the role.
Liberal Public Safety Minister Gary Anandasangaree says that he will recuse himself from any conversation involving the Sri Lankan terrorist group, the Tamil Tigers, citing a potential conflict of interest.
British Columbia has a new centre-right party with official party status in the BC legislature called OneBC. Hello Canada, it's Monday, June 16th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Isaac Lamoureux.
And I'm Noah Jarvis.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, will be stepping down from her role after 8 years of service and controversial oversight of federal COVID-19 pandemic policies. Tam became a household name and a controversial figure during the pandemic, where she featured in dozens of public news conferences to update the public on the pandemic on a regular basis. Tam was at the forefront of the federal government's messaging during the pandemic and was a central authority figure in making policy recommendations to the government to mitigate the pandemic's effects. During the pandemic, Tam made a number of controversial public statements and recommended that the government take a top-down, domineering approach to controlling the pandemic with social distancing requirements, mask mandates, and vaccine passports. At the beginning of Canada's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, Tam advised Canadians that wearing a mask in public was not necessary for healthy individuals, even warning the masks could lead to a further spreading of the virus. However, masks would become a central component to the government's response to the pandemic, mandating the use of masks in every part of the country. So much so that in September 2020, Tam advised Canadians to wear masks while having sex and for couples to avoid kissing. Tam was a leading voice behind the government's restrictions on international travel, enforcing mandatory testing and aggressive quarantine requirements. The requirements resulted in dozens of travelers being hit with fines over $1,000. Tam was also a champion of recommending and encouraging compliance with the government's vaccine passport system, despite acknowledging that there was no evidence that vaccine passports would work in mitigating the spread of COVID-19. During her time as Chief Public Health Officer, Tam frequently referred to pregnant women or mothers as pregnant people or breastfeeding people in an attempt to use progressive and gender-neutral language. Tam leaves the role as Canada's top health official on June 20th, having presided over a marked decline in public trust in health institutions. So Noah, how will Canadians remember Theresa Tam and her management of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, they'll probably not remember it very fondly. Theresa Tam, as you mentioned, became the public face of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic at the federal level, at least. And during her time, she made a number of just controversial and, quite frankly, asinine statements. For example, her flip-flopping on the mask issue really confused Canadians and really led to the beginning of a lot of the distrust that we saw in public health officials, justifiably so, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, where they advised that you should not be wearing a mask in order to save PPE for our healthcare officials, and instead to carry on your daily tasks and not to panic, and then switching on a dime and basically saying that if you leave your house without a mask, you could face fines, and if you don't pay those fines you could be arrested. So masks became a central component to the pandemic response, well, whereas in the beginning it was something to be avoided. Similarly, Tam and many public health experts reassured Canadians that the government would not be taking such a authoritarian top-down approach to mitigating the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, this was the opposite of what had developed in the next coming years, with vaccine mandates, with mask mandates, with international travel restrictions. So much so that it generated a lot of anger and created the Freedom Convoy, which was largely a protest against public health officials like Theresa Tam. And the Freedom Convoy, while it being a bit of a divisive issue for many Canadians, at least half of the Canadian public was sympathetic with the cause, if not outright supporting the Freedom Convoy, basically doubling down on the fact that Theresa Tam had lost the confidence of the public. As a public health official, as the chief public health officer, your goal is to ensure that the public remains confident in the government and their response to the pandemic. However, that was the opposite of what happened. We saw a marked decline in public trust in health institutions over these past years, and that damage has not been restored in these recent years for a good reason. I mean, after several years of public health officials giving false promises to the Canadian public, saying, oh, we just need to reach a vaccination rate of 75%, and then all the pandemic restrictions can go away. And then Canada reaching an 81% vaccination rate, and the mask mandates and the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates, they all remained. Meanwhile, the people who were unvaccinated, who decided not to take a vaccine for legitimate reasons or just reasons that concern their own health, they were demonized and they were made into sort of electoral fodder for the Liberal Party to win a re-election in 2021. And a lot of that was narratives that were pursued by Chief Health Officer Theresa Tam. So I don't really think Theresa Tam will be remembered fondly, at least by half the Canadian public. Sure, maybe the half of the Canadian public that was really enthusiastic about lockdowns and the government's response might remember her fondly. But for a whole other half of the Canadian public, she is a representation of much of the pain and hardship that Canadians had to go through during the pandemic that they potentially did not have to go through had the government not taken such a domineering authoritarian approach to responding to the pandemic. Public Safety Minister Gary Anandasangaree said that he would recuse himself from any conversation regarding two designated terrorist groups based in Sri Lanka. Anandasangaree cited a potential conflict of interest tied to his personal background and community ties as a Sri Lankan native of Tamil origin who immigrated to Canada from Sri Lanka in 1983. The two groups in question are the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam and the World Tamil Movement. In a published statement sent to Global News on Tuesday, Anandasangaree's office said he had stepped away from, quote, any matter related to the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, Tamil Tigers, or the World Tamil Movement out of an abundance of caution. The statement came in response to questions about the conflict of interest disclosure. His office had earlier stated that the minister had asked officials, quote, to implement a screen on any national security issues relating to the Tamil community due to his roots in Sri Lanka and his history of involvement with Tamil diaspora issues. Public Safety Canada maintains a federal list of terrorist entities which lists both groups. The Tamil Tigers, responsible for a protracted civil war in Sri Lanka, were designated as a terrorist organization by Canada in 2006. The World Tamil Movement was added in 2008, with RCMP investigations linking it to fundraising activities in support of the Tamil Tigers. The Tamil Tigers are designated as a terrorist group by the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and India. India was the first country to apply the terrorism designation in 1992 in response to the 1991 assassination of Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi by a Tamil Tigers suicide bomber. True North reached out to the Sri Lankan and Indian embassies but did not receive a reply in time. So, Isaac, I think it would concern a lot of Canadians to know that the chief politician responsible for Canada's public safety is unable to decide on matters that concern certain terrorist organizations. So, Isaac, how can Minister Anandasangaree carry out his task as the public safety minister if he cannot be involved in discussions concerning terrorist organizations like the Tamil Tigers?
Yeah, Noah. So obviously, Minister Anandasangaree's decision to recuse himself from matters involving the Tamil Tigers and the World Tamil Movement raises serious concerns about his ability to fully execute his role as public safety minister, especially since, as you said, both groups are designated terrorist entities on Canada's official list, along with 77 other for a total of 79 entities. So, as the minister responsible for national security, counterterrorism, and the oversight of intelligence agencies, his portfolio includes serious responsibilities related to the listing, delisting, and monitoring of terrorist organizations. And by stepping away from any involvement in issues related to the two entities due to his personal conflict stemming from his Tamil heritage and past advocacy, it potentially limits his ability to provide oversight or input on matters within his jurisdiction. And while his office states that the move was made out of an abundance of caution, it raises the question of whether such a recusal creates a precedent where personal background can compromise engagement with sensitive national security files, and it also puts additional pressure on deputy ministers or other cabinet members to fill the resulting policy gap. Ultimately, if a minister cannot engage with designated terrorist groups due to personal affiliations, it could be argued that it calls into question whether that individual can serve impartially and fully in a role that demands comprehensive oversight over all national security threats, regardless of origin. And listeners may remember Anandasangaree from Conservative MP Andrew Lawton's basic line of questioning to him, where he failed to answer basic questions surrounding Canada's gun laws. And this has become a recurring theme for Lawton, exposing Liberal ministers for not knowing basic questions about their files. Because, of course, shortly after, Lawton later revealed the Treasury Board President Shafkat Ali, who similarly couldn't answer basic questions about Canada's ballooning federal service. Two former BC Conservative MLAs have launched a new centre-right party named OneBC, led in the interim by Vancouver Kilchena MLA Dallas Brody and joined by Kelowna Lake Country Coldstream MLA Tara Armstrong. OneBC notably did not have the support of former BC Conservative MLA Jordan Keeley, who had departed from the party in solidarity with Brody's expulsion. Brody claims that the BC Conservatives and NDP have made a mockery of British Columbian democracy and promised to bring democratic, economic, and social reform to the province to reverse socialist policies. Brody said, quote, "After nearly a decade of socialist policies, our province is falling apart. And when I realized that none of the other parties had the integrity or courage to make the bold changes we need to survive, I knew it was time to build something new." The party made several bold policy proposals, namely a promise to cut the income tax by 50% for those making $100,000 and under, and a 25% tax cut for everyone else, including on corporate income. On culture, OneBC is promising to confront the issue of declining birth rates and marriage rates, dismantle what it calls the reconciliation industry, forbid teachers' unions from striking by legislating education as an essential service, and put an end to the flow of fentanyl from China. OneBC also promises to allow British Columbians to choose private healthcare options and purchase private insurance for this care. On democratic reform, OneBC is promising to end the practice of multi-day voting and conduct same-day, in-person voting using paper ballots with the results being counted by hand. The party is also proposing to allow for referendums on major issues and lowering the threshold to recall an MLA. Since the NDP lowered the threshold to achieving official party status within the legislature, OneBC will be able to obtain such status, granting them a host of privileges, including receiving taxpayer funding, office space, and time during question period. In a comment to True North, a spokesperson from the OneBC leaders' office alleged the party is expecting a number of MLAs to join in the coming months and encouraged independent MLA Jordan Keeley to join the party. The spokesperson said, quote, "Jordan Keeley is welcome to join OneBC, as is any other MLA who is prepared to fight for this province with courage and integrity. In the coming weeks and months, we expect a number of MLAs to join us." However, Keeley issued a statement saying he will not be joining the party, instead deciding to focus on issues that matter to his constituents. OneBC tells True North that they endeavor to do something similar in the next election, seeking to form government as a legitimate goal. So, Noah, will OneBC become a major party in BC fighting to form government, or will they become a provincial version of the NDP, as the BC Conservatives are beginning to suggest?
It remains to be seen. I don't think that the BC Conservatives are dead in the water by the announcement of the formation of OneBC. Quite the contrary, I think that the BC Conservatives had really displaced BC United, the former BC Liberal Party, because there was a gap within British Columbian politics and what the people wanted, and the BC Conservatives had filled that gap. But if they do not continue to fill that political demand, to fill the demand for educational reform, to fulfill the demand for taxation and regulatory reform, to fulfill the demand to reform British Columbia's healthcare sector, I think that the OneBC will rise in that environment. As Dallas Brody had pointed out, the BC Conservatives have moved left on a number of issues. For example, the BC Conservatives were ardent in calling out SOGI 123 in British Columbia's education system, especially in the last parliament when they were still trying to make a name for themselves and trying to contrast themselves against BC United. However, they have started to abandon their focus on talking about Soji 123, and this is in correspondence with MLAs like Eleanor Sturko gaining influence in the party's leadership and really taking on the leadership role and whipping other MLAs into shape and basically telling them that they cannot speak too ardently on these issues. You also have someone like Aaliyah Warbus, who is now a very influential figure in the party's leadership, helping to determine their approach on indigenous issues. And she is one of the catalysts for Dallas Brody being expelled from the party. Aaliyah Warbus was very much against how Dallas Brody was talking about the indigenous residential school, specifically Dallas Brody's factual claim that there were no bodies found at the former Kamloops Indigenous Residential School, which, as the CBC reported, there was apparently 215 bodies, but no body has been discovered. No body has been excavated. All that has been discovered were soil disruptions, and yet this offended Aaliyah Warbus, leading to Dallas Brody's expulsion and Tara Armstrong and Keeley leaving the party in solidarity. However, OneBC could fall into certain pitfalls, and that Jordan Keeley decided not to join the party. This might be a worrying sign for the party that one of the independent MLAs who left the caucus with Brody decided not to join OneBC. Perhaps he does not agree with the goals of the party or with the leadership of the party. And quite frankly, the BC Conservatives just formed the official opposition. I think many British Columbians might be wanting to give them a second chance, giving them a bit more time to refine their message. At the end of the day, even though the BC Conservatives on paper are a party that's existed for over 100 years, in actuality, this is a party that has only really been around for a couple years now, and there's going to be growing pains with a party that has not really been around, especially in the mainstream of British Columbian politics for many, many years. There is going to be growing pains, and the BC Conservatives, they haven't even had to reconcile the fact that they have a leader, John Rustad, who sure I think is well liked amongst the party in general, personally. However, he might not be the most savvy political operator, and you could replace the BC Conservative leader with someone who's a bit more charismatic, who can talk a bit more passionately on issues and especially relate to younger British Columbians on many of the issues, like someone say Pierre Poilievre or someone like Danielle Smith, someone like even Doug Ford, who can generate some sort of folksy charm and really relate to people in that way. I think John Rustad, out of those leaders that I just mentioned, is definitely the weakest amongst them. So if the BC Conservatives decide to change up their leadership, decide to go harder on certain issues that matter to conservatives, they could suck up the oxygen from OneBC and really limit their growth. However, if they decide not to do this and they decide to drift away from the values that made them popular in the first place, I think that OneBC has a very good shot of displacing them in the way that the BC Conservatives had just displaced BC United.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.